Dorsal stream, conscious awareness? Remember, two systems approach includes the assumption that dorsal stream processing is not accessible to consciousness. It is hard to test this assumption because of the difficulties in disentangling the relative contributions of the dorsal and ventral streams on most tasks involving visual guided action. Suppose, however, we used a very simple task such as reaching out for a target while avoiding obstacles, example 2 rods. Milner reviewed research indicating this task can be performed by the dorsal stream alone and in the absence of conscious awareness. We will briefly discuss relevant evidence. McIntosh and others used an obstacle avoidance task, see figure 2.15. On the next page, 55, they tested a male patient, VE, who had suffered a stroke in the right hemisphere. As a result, he had extinction, involving greatly impaired conscious awareness of a stimulus presented to his left visual field in the presence of another stimulus presented to his right visual field. VE took full account of a rod presented as an obstacle in his left visual field, even when he claimed not to have seen it. Thus, his reaching behaviour was influenced by visual information of which he was not conscious. Evidence that the dorsal stream is crucially important in reaching behaviour is supported by another research. For example, Schindler and others found two patients with optic ataxia involving extensive dorsal stream damage showed no ability to vary their reaching behaviour to avoid obstacles. Roseboom and Arnold, 2011, presented visual stimuli to healthy individuals, followed by masking to prevent them from being seen. In spite of their total lack of conscious awareness of the orientation of the stimuli presented, they nevertheless learnt to orient their grasp reasonably appropriately. Thus, visually guided action can occur in the absence of conscious awareness and with the probable use of the dorsal stream. You may be feeling somewhat bewildered by now. After all, when you reach out to pick up an object, you typically have full conscious awareness of the object, of any obstacles, and of the position of your hand. However, such conscious awareness is apparently not essential for visually guided action. Nevertheless, it may well be useful. For example, even though Roseboom and Arnold's participants performed well above chance, their performance was still markedly inferior to what it would have been if the stimuli had been visible. Overall evaluation. Milner and Goodale's theoretical approach has been very influential. Their central assumption that there are two visual what and how systems is probably broadly correct. This assumption has received support from two types of research. First, studies on patients with optic ataxia, damage to the dorsal stream, and visual agnosia, damage to the ventral stream, have produced the predicted double dissociation. Second, studies involving the visual illusions have often produced the surprising, but theoretically predicted, finding that action-based performance, example pointing, sometimes grasping, is almost immune to illusory effects. And third, the assumption that the processing in the dorsal stream is not accessible to consciousness has received reasonable support. What are the limitations of the two systems approach? First, there is too much emphasis on the independence of the two systems rather than their interactions. Kloutman reviewed the evidence and concluded that information is transferred directly between the two pathways at multiple stages and locations along their trajectories. Second, and related to the first point, there is the thorny issue of how these interactions occur given the very different nature of visual processing in the two streams. A possible explanation is provided by the frame and fill approach. Rapid, coarse processing in the dorsal stream provides the frame for slower and more precise ventral stream processing, the fill. Third, the original notion, since abandoned by Milner and Goodale, that visually guided action depends almost entirely on the dorsal stream is incorrect. The dorsal stream is probably used on its own or with minimal ventral stream involvement only when someone performs rudimentary actions to simple targets. The ventral stream seems to be involved whenever action planning and programming are required. Fourth, the claimed double dissociation between optic ataxia and visual form agnosia is not clear-cut. Some patients with visual form agnosia have severe problems with visually guided action as well as vision for perception. In addition, Some patients with optic ataxia have impaired visual perception for stimuli presented to peripheral vision as well as impaired visually guided action. And fifth, it is often difficult to make firm predictions from the theory. This is because most visual tasks require the use of both processing streams. The subtle changes in the nature of the task can influence their relative use. It seems strange to me that they would cut off the reading on page 56, which is halfway through trichromatic theory and doesn't cover opponent process and dual process theory. So I think I'm just going to finish it, continue reading until it comes to that, which is page 58. And then you go back to the e-text, which goes on to hearing. So, okay. Colour vision. Why has colour vision developed? After all, if you see an old black and white movie on television, you can easily make sense of the moving images. One reason is that colour often makes an object stand out from its background, making it easier to distinguish figure from ground. Chameleons very sensibly can change colour to blend in with their immediate surroundings, thus reducing their chances of being detected by predators. Another reason is that colour perception helps us to recognise and categorise objects. For example, it is useful when deciding whether a piece of fruit is underripe, ripe or overripe. Predicting coding, which involves processing the unpredicted components of sensory input, is also relevant. It allows us to focus rapidly on any aspects of the incoming visual signal, example discolouring, discrepant with predictions based on ripe fruit. Before proceeding, we must consider the meaning of the word colour. There are three main qualities associated with colour. One is the hue, and the hue is the colour itself and what distinguishes red from yellow or blue. Two is brightness. Brightness is the perceived intensity of light. And three is saturation. This allows us to determine whether a colour is vivid or pale, and it is influenced by the amount of white present. So hue, brightness and saturation. So trichromacy theory. The cones in the retina are specialised for colour vision. Cone receptors contain light-sensitive photopigment, allowing them to respond to light. According to trichromatic, three-coloured theory, there are three different kinds of cone receptors. One type is especially sensitive to short wavelength light and generally responds most to stimuli perceived as blue. A second type of cone receptor is most sensitive to medium wavelength light and responds greatly to stimuli generally seen as yellow-green. The third type of cone receptor responds most to long wavelength light, such as that coming from stimuli perceived as orange-red. So remember, blue was the shortest wavelength, green was about mid, and red is the longest wavelength. How do we see other colours? According to the theory, most stimuli activate two or all three cone types. The colour we perceive is determined by the relative levels of stimulation of each cone type. Many forms of colour deficiency are consistent with trichromacy theory. Most individuals with colour deficiency have dichromacy, in which one cone class is missing. In deuteranopia, whatever that is, medium wavelength cones are missing. In protanopia, long wavelength red cones are missing, and in tritanopia, short wavelength blue wavelength cones are missing. Why has evolution equipped us with three types of cones? It is a very efficient system. We can discriminate millions of colours, even with so few cone types. Note, however, that many animal species have more than three types of cones, so effective colour vision can be achieved in various ways. And there's two key terms. One is dichromacy, and that's the deficiency in colour vision in which one of the three cone classes is missing, and negative afterimage, which is described as the illusory perception of the complementary colour to the one that has been fixated. Green is the complementary colour to red, and blue is the complementary colour to yellow, which is quite different in design because it's blue and orange in design, and purple and yellow, and red and green. Anyway, opponent processes. Trichromacy theory does not explain what happens after activation of the cone receptors. It also does not account for negative afterimages, which is the key term that I just mentioned. If you stare at a square in a given colour for several seconds and then shift your gaze to a white surface, you will see a negative after image in the complementary colour, which you have done or are about to do in one of the weekly tasks. And it says complementary colours produce white when combined. For example, a green square produces a red after image, whereas a blue square produces a yellow after image. Herring explained negative after images. He argued that there are 3 types of opponent processes in the visual system. One opponent process, red-green channel, produces perception of green when responding one way and of red when responding the opposite way. A second opponent process, blue-yellow channel, produces perception of blue or yellow in the same way. The third opponent process, the achromatic channel, produces the perception of white at one extreme and of black at the other. What is the value of having these 3 opponent processes? There is evidence that the 3 dimensions associated with opponent processes provide maximally independent representations of colour information. As a result, the opponent processes provide very efficient encoding of the chromatic stimuli. Several lines of research support the notion of opponent processes. First, opponent cells have been identified in monkeys. Second, the theory accounts for negative after images. Prolonged viewing of a given colour, example red, produces one extreme of activity in the relevant opponent process. When attention is then directed to a white surface, the opponent process moves to its other extreme, thus producing the negative after image. The existence of opponent processes also explains some types of colour deficiency. Red-green deficiency occurs when the high or medium wavelength codes are damaged or missing, and so the red-green channel cannot be used. Blue-yellow deficiency occurs when the individuals lacking the short wavelength cones cannot make effective use of the blue-yellow channel. I guess it also explains why we can't see reddish-green or bluish-yellow. The dual process theory. Hurwitz and Jemison proposed a dual process theory combining the ideas discussed so far. Signals from the 3 cone types identified by trichromacy theory are sent to the opponent cells. There are 3 channels, and you'll see a figure on the next page, which will be 58, and it's figure 2.16. The achromatic non-colour channel combines the activity of the medium and long wavelength cones. The blue-yellow channel represents the difference between the sum of the medium and long wavelength cones on the other hand, and the short wavelength cones on the other. The direction of difference determines whether blue or yellow is seen. Finally, the red-green channel represents the difference between activity levels in the medium and long wavelength cones. The direction of this difference determines whether red or green is perceived. And I tell you what, this is just described in such a complex way that it's really hard to comprehend what they're actually saying. I think this could be explained so much simpler. So to simplify, dual processing is basically trichromatic theory, which is that we have 3 different coloured cones, red, green and blue, and opponent process theory is when those cones get bored, so the cone sends signals to the retinal ganglion cells that respond to pairs of colours, and that was the red, green, blue, yellow and black, white, and then they compute the difference between the 2 colours. Evaluation. There is much experimental support for opponent process theory, however it is greatly oversimplified. For example, the proportions of different cone types vary considerably across individuals, but this has surprisingly little effect on colour perception. Second, the arrangement of cone types in the eye is fairly random. This seems odd because it presumably makes it hard for colour opponent processes to work effectively. In sum, the processes involved in colour vision are much more complicated than previously believed. And that is the end of the eye stuff, vision stuff. I've gone brain dead.